Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Marita's program on legal and technical implications, practical implications of safely operating commercial and residential properties at a time of COVID-19. I want to thank all the participants.
Good morning, everybody.
I want to thank all the participants and everyone who has registered for the program. And I want to
commercial and residential properties.
I want to specifically thank Norway Savings Bank. Norway Savings Bank has been wonderful as the sponsor of Marita's morning breakfast programs. I want to let everybody know that everybody has a chat option on their computer or iPad, and we will be monitoring all these questions. And on the last 10 minutes of the program, we will make sure that all of your brilliant questions are given exciting answers. My name is David Soley. I am a real estate trial lawyer at the law firm of Bernstein Sure, and I'm bringing with me today a phenomenal all-star cast of people who have tremendous amounts of information on our topic. With us today is Drew Swenson. Drew Swenson is a prestigious commercial landlord that I think most of us know. He is the president of Swenson and Company, which is a Maine company. I am also bringing with us today Jonathan Cully. Jonathan Cully is a renowned residential landlord who owns hundreds of residential units in Maine, and he is the principal of Redfern Properties. Also with us today is Jeffrey Lind. Jeffrey Lind is the Chief Operating Officer of Clark Insurance, which is one of the best brokerage houses in Maine for landlords seeking insurance. Jamie Schwartz will not be able to be with us today because of technical difficulties, but I am going to handle the legal portion. So we will make sure all of your questions, thoughts, and surmises are responded to. I'm going to start today with Drew Swenson. Drew, you own many commercial buildings. Most of your tenants in commercial buildings are on lockdown. The state of Maine is beginning to open up, but the COVID risk is there. The COVID risk is just as serious as it was prior to the lockdown, many people are saying. And what are you doing to keep your buildings safe, and what do you recommend for other commercial landlords in our area?
Sure. Thank you, David. And thanks everyone for joining Marita today. I'm hoping I can add some value here to the thought process. So, David, the reality is we are in a very fluid situation. I think you hear that term all the time because each day we get more updates, more guidance, more information. So what we may say today might have to be revised at some point as we learn more. But in this ever-changing situation, it's important that we note, both as landlords or property managers and working with tenants, that this is a shared responsibility. I mean, what we're trying to do is not to eliminate risk, because we really can't, but we can do things together that minimize risk. But it is a shared obligation. So what we are trying to do is make sure we stay as updated and informed as possible, that we share links and our thoughts in a very open communication format with our property managers, with our partners, our owners, with our tenants. And as you can imagine, each tenant is different: commercial, ground floor service, retail, non-service retail, restaurant or bar. They all have different situations. So really the safety of each is a different case-by-case analysis. But if we take the approach that we follow CDC and state guidance and or requirements, and we encourage everyone to read and stay informed, we have a better opportunity to keep safety at everybody's foremost attention as we reopen. So we work with all of our tenants and all of our properties to ensure that there are frequent email communications, frequent links to the most updated information. And I think for anybody who uses a payroll company, you'll notice these payroll companies now have really quite good COVID reopening links on their sites. So I'd urge everybody to probably look at those, because it's amazing what those national companies are able to pull together for good detail. And as I look at, for example, on my in my tax world, my tax side of my life, we have offices and people in Miami, in New York City, in Boston, and in Portland. And each state is totally different. Each city is totally different with what it's expecting. And so what we've done, in addition to all this communication, is we're starting to publish rules and regulations. Some of them are requirements that are mandated by the state. Others are merely recommendations. But again, we need to, and the tenants need to, and the people in the building need to stay current on all of that, because it changes sometimes on a daily basis. And we work with all of our vendors as well. In addition to this tenant side and making sure the tenants are educated, we also have to work with our vendors, because for example, the janitorial staff, the HVAC, preventative maintenance or repair side of the team, the technicians. What are we doing with them? When are we doing it for reopening? What are we doing to make sure the systems are as clean as possible? And so we have typically written plans, written commitments from those vendors, those contractors, to ensure that they are following all of the requirements or recommendations that the CDC or others have put forth. So everything we are doing right now, whether it's disinfecting, whether it's maintaining logs of people coming in for later tracking purposes, whether it's taking infrared temperature of everybody who comes into various office spaces, those things are occurring at least for the foreseeable future, because we have to, not only for current safety, to be able to manage incident plans if an incident happens and report that out to the right people, but also to minimize risk and generate confidence in the tenants coming into our commercial buildings that these are safe places. So that's a big overview, David, but that's generally what we're trying to do in all the buildings that we're involved with.
Are you doing anything, Drew, with walkways or security desks or elevators? What about those
With
areas?
regard to, because most of our buildings and the buildings we see in Maine generally are typically, I'll call them unsecured. They're not like a New York or Boston or other major metropolitan city where we have security guards in those buildings who then manage one person per elevator at a time. So in Maine, it becomes really a self-policing kind of concept. What we're doing as people enter buildings is we have the CDC COVID checklist. If you have these symptoms, please don't come in. Or if someone in your family has these symptoms, please don't come in. So it's really a self-assessment, self-policing honor system at that point. And then within the elevators, both inside and outside, it's please maintain social distancing. Please wear face masks if you're in the elevator and there's more than one person in this elevator. Or please keep one person in this elevator, because it is too small. There are many buildings in Maine that have elevators that simply don't allow for more than one person to be in, because they're less than 6 feet in width, for example. So what we're doing is lots of signage, and we're asking people in general to be reasonable and prudent, and to use their good judgment based upon the information that we're providing or posting, so that they know what's expected of them.
Any changes with HVAC systems, Drew, or plumbing systems, or those something
So
that are?
with regard to plumbing, certainly, I think in all of our buildings, there were enough essential services in each of the commercial buildings that the plumbing systems continued to be operated throughout the shutdown. So we didn't have a situation where water had become stagnant or stale and we would have to flush the systems. But that certainly is a recommended protocol if a building has been shut down and the waters have not been moving. On the HVAC side of things, we've increased the frequency of all filter changes, where the compressor motors and blower fans are able to accommodate HEPA filters, which are a denser filter, without overheating the systems. The regular filter systems have been changed to the HEPA filter systems. And then we're also, as often as possible, looking at retrofitting the systems with some of these ionization or UV light systems in the ductwork, so that we can try to kill whatever viruses may be in the systems. That becomes then an issue between landlord and tenant as to who is responsible for those costs. If we have a small tenant space where there are maybe 3 people in there at any one time, and they're all socially distant, and it's the tenant's responsibility to maintain air quality, they may not want to replace or add an ionization or a UV light filtration system into their portion of the HVAC. But if somebody is a nail salon or a hair salon, that becomes very important to them, because they have such a high frequency of people coming through their facilities that they really do need to maintain a higher level of air quality confidence.
Thank you. And Jonathan Cully, you own hundreds of residential units throughout Maine. While many of Drew Swenson's tenants are on lockdown, I'm assuming that the vast majority of people in your buildings are home. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on improving safety and how you're managing in this time of COVID crisis.
Yeah, thanks, David. And a great point is sort of the intensity of use in commercial buildings has declined. The intensity of use in our buildings, residential buildings, has increased. And so people are spending a lot of time at home. But there's also a different set of issues in terms of, you know, what we can say to people about how they live in their homes versus how they operate in their places of work. So yeah, all good questions, and I'm happy to talk about it a little bit. You know, the first thing that we did when this sort of went down in the middle of March is said, okay, what can we do for our tenants? So the obvious thing that comes to mind is sort of an increased cleaning, disinfecting routine. So we start disinfecting elevators, you know, twice a day with a focus on, you know, elevator buttons with crash bars in the building. So sort of surfaces that people are you know, touching on a regular basis. You know, increased cleaning, provides hand sanitizer in lobbies. Signage, as Drew mentioned, is a big one. And you know, we're asking people, you know, one household per elevator at a time. We're asking people to wear masks in common areas. In some cases, we're shutting down common areas. I'll give you the story of our Hiawatha building, which is also known as sort of the Joe's Super Variety building, but it's 140 residential units, and we have some sort of common amenity spaces. We've got a tenant lounge where people watch TV and plug into Wi-Fi and can socialize, and we shut that down sort of from day one. We've also got a fairly active fitness center in that room, and we tried to shut that down from day one. There was guidance from the city manager in Portland that fitness centers needed to close. And there was some ambiguity as to whether those were commercial fitness centers, private fitness centers. But with, you know, absent guidance, we said, all right, let's close our fitness center. Our tenants quickly revolted, many of them saying, look, we're stuck at home. We've got nothing to do. You know, exercise is our source of sanity. And you've got to reopen the fitness center. So we worked closely with our tenants to put together a schedule. And it's almost been self-directed. It's been pretty impressive where the tenants have created a online schedule that they can access, and it's sort of on your honor, but no more than 3 people in the fitness room at the same time, no more than 2 from the same household. And it's worked wonderfully, and they've sort of you know, continued to carry it on. So there's a lot of the sort of, we're in this together amongst our tenants. There's a lot of cooperation and appreciation that you know, they share a home, although they've got independent living areas. You know, they're sharing these spaces. So a lot of sort of self-policing. In that regard, the privacy issue is a pretty big deal. I mean, we would never take people's temperature as they walk into our building like you might be able to do in an office building. You know, we're making recommendations. Could you wear a mask in a common area? We're not going to restrict guests. We're not going to do health screening. Frankly, it's just inappropriate to do when you're providing somebody a home. So, you know, I think the privacy issues have been a big one for us. As Drew mentioned, communication is huge. When this first went down in mid-March, I have different property managers in each of my multifamily buildings, and I seldom communicate to tenants. But in this case, I did, because I saw that this was just sort of a bigger issue. It's something we haven't experienced before. And so I wanted to make sure that there was sort of communication from the highest level with tenants. And then I always recommend to property owners, landlords, you can never sort of communicate too much when there's a crisis or some difficult situation. So I communicated to them very directly, shared a lot of information. You mentioned HVAC, because I developed all of our apartments. They're fairly new construction, and one of the sort of the building practices we use is we put in individual ventilation systems in each apartment. So in our 139 unit apartment building, there are 139 separate ventilation systems, each ventilated separately to the outside and self-contained within an apartment dwelling. And so we communicated. Some people didn't know this. We communicated to them how their ventilation system works, and I got more response on that than anything else. People were appreciative and felt like that was sort of an important consideration. Frankly, the science with respect to aerosols, I don't know if it is or isn't, but people felt a lot of peace of mind because they knew they had their own ventilation system.
And I presume that a lot of these
thing-
tenants, when you communicated to them, I assume a lot of these tenants said, by the way, I don't have a lot of money right now. Did you get a lot of that response?
Yeah, so yeah, that's the next thing I want to talk about is financial hardship. And when this started in March, we sort of all knew we were headed toward a recession. Nobody knew. Well, we probably knew that it was going to be a deep recession. We didn't know how long the recession was going to be. So we all presumed there was going to be a significant amount of financial hardship. So the note I sent out on March 16th, I sort of invited all of our tenants to start a conversation if they felt like they were going to be impacted. And what we've done, David, is we created a financial hardship form. And anyone who reaches out to us, we provide them a form and we ask them for information. How much money were you making? What was your job before the COVID-19 crisis? What's your situation now? How has your employment been impacted? Have your hours been reduced, or have you been laid off, or have you been furloughed? We asked, have you applied for unemployment insurance? Have you gotten your $1,200 stimulus check? Are you impacted by this PPP program? So ask sort of what assistance they were seeking from the federal, state government. And once we got that information back, we engaged in a conversation. I know you're going to talk about it in a little bit. There's a question of forgiveness of rent and forbearance of rent. Forgiveness meaning, don't worry about it. You don't ever owe the rent. Forbearance meaning, we're going to catch up with you later. A couple comments. One, I've been surprised by how few requests we've had for financial assistance, and I think it's partly reflective of our portfolio. Generally speaking, the apartments that we own in Portland are what I would consider, they're new construction, air conditioning, and washer dryers, and so I would consider them Class A apartments relative to the market. And so we tend to get more professional employees. We get a lot of nurses, some resident doctors, young lawyers, engineers, people who work at WEX or IDEX. And so, I would say our tenants have had more durable employment than maybe, people who have lower end apartments, maybe having a lot of service workers. So we've had pretty durable employment, and so our requests for forgiveness and forbearance have been lower than I expected. On the other hand, we have some commercial suites, ground floor sort of retail in our buildings. And because we've had such good success with payment in our residential, we've offered, I would say, we've had the luxury of offering more forgiveness in these commercial suites. And so, for example, in our building in Bayside, we've got a wonderful restaurant. And we knew from the beginning that they were going to be hammered. And we also know that that's a really, really tough business. And furthermore, the restaurant Bharat is really sort of key to what I call placemaking in our Bayside building. It makes the neighborhood more appealing. It makes the residences above more appealing. And so we wanted to make sure that they were strong and able to come out of this whenever that is. And frankly, with respect to restaurants, the back to normal is not until we get a vaccine that may be 6, 8, 12 months out. So we've been forgiving rent for some of our retail tenants, again, because we had the luxury to do so. If our portfolio was exclusively retail, I would probably be taking a different tack. But we're able to, to be pretty good to some of the commercial tenants to make sure they come out of it strong.
Are you finding that there are beginning to be more people who are asking for financial assistance? I mean, the stimulus checks now are a couple of months old. The PPP loans are expiring. Is it getting worse?
The answer is no, and that's a really good question. You sort of wonder, is there a lag effect? We heard from a lot of people immediately. I mean, those people who had jobs, we have a massage therapist who I've been talking to who was out of work. We've got people who work at breweries who had to shut down. I haven't seen a sort of a new rash of hardship requests, if that's your question. I mean, most of the employees seem to be, if they're medical employees or they're professional employees. I think the ones who were going to get laid off or furloughed, that was done in April. Now there may be a further round if this recession continues. but we haven't seen a sort of a next round of forgiveness requests.
Thank you, John. Jeffrey Lind, your underwriters are insuring commercial and residential landlords all over the state of Maine and other states. Is there anything that your carriers are recommending? What are they telling landlords to do, or is Clark Associates have recommendations for landlords?
Well, as we move to, thank you, David. As we move towards a reopening and businesses reopening and trying to get back to business, reopening has been a priority for all businesses, and that includes landlords as well. Many insurance carriers have not issued specific guidance, but rather are deferring to the CDC guidance. And really, the CDC guidance is just that, guidance and a general framework for evaluating reopening plans. Because it's every building's different, every business is different. Some buildings have elevators, some buildings don't, and every building's layout is a little bit different. So what it really, what carriers are expecting is to utilize the guidance that's available to comply with all local, state, and federal laws and requirements, and then to undergo a thoughtful process of risk management, just like what Drew and Jonathan have described, which is communication with tenants and developing plans together to address risk. Because as Drew said, it is a shared risk and a shared responsibility, and whereas a landlord and a tenant work together to ensure the safety of patrons to the business, or in Jonathan's case, safety of the residents. And I can speak from our own experience of working with our own landlord here in Portland, working together closely to identify security issues, areas. What were we going to do about the HVAC system, which we actually did work together to, and are having an air ionization system installed. So while the insurance industry hasn't issued a lot of specific guidance, I think that's because there is a lot of expectations out there that that CDC guidance will be complied with, and the other information from government agencies. One of the things that's oh, go ahead, David. If you had a question.
No, one of the things that you sell, and one of the things that most commercial and residential landlords have, is business interruption insurance. This is one of the most disruptive events in our lifetime. Do you have any thoughts on what people should do who have that type of insurance?
Sure. Well, this has been one of the tougher areas to deal with from an insurance perspective. From an overall industry standpoint, generally the news has been that the pandemic and a business closing because of the pandemic hasn't necessarily triggered business interruption coverage, because there hasn't been any physical damage to a building. It just had to shut down, but it wasn't actually physically affected. Now that's going to be litigated in the courts. That's going to take time to work out. And so the recommendation that we made to our client base from day one was, if you have if you've suffered a loss of business, report it to your insurance carrier, submit a claim. It's up to the insurance carrier to review the policy, investigate the circumstances, and make a decision with respect to coverage. What we are seeing is that most claims are at this stage being denied, but anything can happen. So we're encouraging folks to submit their claims, and if there is some sort of government intervention down the line, see where that we'll see where that goes. At least you'll have your claim in the queue, so to speak.
And I noticed that one of the issues that certain senators and congressmen are taking up is whether to help insurance companies fund those business interruption claims. I take it if insurance companies were to fund them without government assistance, there probably wouldn't be any insurance companies left in the country, I assume. So
that is what I've been hearing as well. And you could look in different trade publications and see different numbers. But in general, what we hear is that if the insurance industry was compelled to pay, COVID business interruption losses, it would be the largest insurance event in history by far, and then would leave the industry unable to take care of other events that were intended to be insured. So it's a difficult thing to deal with right now. I would suspect that going forward there will be some sort of government method of insuring against pandemic risk, similar to what we saw with the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act after 9/11. So that's because it's really that sort of catastrophic event is really beyond the industry's ability to insure at a reasonable premium level. Because that separating that risk out and pricing for it separately versus forcing all policyholders to pay for it. So it's a difficult thing for sure. But I think the biggest issue that we're seeing as customers ask us about reopening is, well, what about liability? What if we get sued because of a virus-related transmission issue? And the news there is a little bit better, which is that most general liability policies do not contain a specific exclusion for viruses. Most policies do contain specific exclusions for mold and fungus, but viruses have not traditionally been specifically excluded. So the carriers have had an endorsement available to them for years called the communicable disease exclusion, but they haven't been putting it on policies. The tough thing right now is we are seeing insurance carriers that are starting to put this exclusion on policies, which would take out coverage for defense costs, awards, judgments, settlements in the event of a COVID-related lawsuit on a going forward basis. And that is a concern. We are seeing carriers starting to attach those exclusions. We're working to identify it early, talk with our customer base about solutions. So I would encourage folks here that are involved with buying insurance for their organizations, start talking with your providers about it and ask questions like, which is my carrier looking to attach these exclusions? What can I expect at renewal? Even if your renewal isn't for months, it's fine to have a dialogue now, so there's no surprises. That's one of the biggest things we're seeing.
Anecdotally, how many carriers are putting these COVID exclusions in the policies? Are you seeing this a lot, or is this just a growing trend?
We've seen, in the last month, I would say I've seen 2 or 3 carriers start to adopt this approach. One local carrier that writes a lot of business in New England has come out with an edict that it will be on every policy going forward. And there is a concern that other insurers may follow suit. So I hope it's not a universal trend throughout the industry. But it's definitely something to pay attention to.
And the practice point being that if I'm buying insurance, I need to speak with you or my insurance broker to make sure that if this is important to me, I'm not buying a policy with this exclusion. I take it.
Absolutely.
Yes. I wanted to, by the way, Drew, are you seeing a lot of your commercial tenants asking for forbearance or forgiveness? How is that looking in the commercial arena? I mean, everyone presumably with under 500 employees has PPP loans, but that 8-week period is running out. I think it has run out, depending when you got
Sure.
the money.
The good news is the SBA came out with revision on that 8-week period. So you can either use, it looks to be a binary choice. You can either use the 8-week period from the date you received the PPP loan, or you can use a 24-week period, but probably not something in between. So I think we've seen some additional latitude. And then the 75% had to be used on payroll costs is now 60%. So I think we're going to see a greater forgiveness on those, which is what really everybody was expecting, that these would be grants of one sort or another. And so those companies that were not taking them for fear that they would end up having a loan now have the ability to really go get them before the June 30th final date, and then have a forgivable amount very easily by using a 24-week date. So what we had done, I think what a lot of other landlords had done, was to early on provide links and information to the tenants, particularly the retail tenants, for the PPP loan, the EIDL loan, the economic injury disaster loan, the employee retention tax credit, the mutual exclusivity discussions on some of those. Now the deferral of the employer's share of the FICA Social Security tax of 6.2% that could be deferred, so basically a non-interest loan. So what we've done, and I think again a lot of other landlords have done, is to, through this very open communication, is to provide a lot of information to the tenants. Some of them who really became ostriches for a while, they ducked down, put their head in the sand, didn't know what to do because they were shut down and it meant the end of their business and perhaps their life financially for some of them. And so by giving them easy access to links, good information, many of them did go out, get these loans. Some are still doing it now that they've rethought about getting it. And that has helped them get through this time period. The question then becomes obviously, how do things look going forward in this interim of new normal? And how well is their cash flow positioned? How good were their reserves before they did this? Like Jonathan, we have also seen tenants coming to us either asking for forgiveness or at least some amount of forbearance. And it is a case-by-case analysis. Every tenant is different. Their business model is different. Their location is different, and their needs are different. So we've had to be fairly flexible. And in some situations, we've entertained the idea of forgiveness at this point in time, but perhaps extending their lease term by the amount of months they're forgiven at this point in time. I think that makes sense if you've got a 2 or 3 year lease agreement in place, because I'll still be alive when I see that happen. But if we have a 10-year lease tenant, I'm not sure we'll own that property or I'll be around. So we've thought more about forbearance in those situations than necessarily forgiveness. And we've obviously helped them with their PPP loans if they've had questions. We've actually been providing some because I have the benefit of having this tax side of my life being a CPA. So I have a lot of clients that I've done work with on the PPP and EIDL loans and the Main Street Lending Loan Program. And as a consequence, a lot of answers I'm able to then give to tenants fairly readily to help them understand what they should or shouldn't do in putting these loan packages together. But I think the federal government did a wonderful job in trying to help on an interim basis. But Jonathan's right. Who knows what's going to happen now as we run through those amounts of monies? And now what do people do if their reopening really doesn't improve their cash flow sufficiently to cover all of their operating expenses?
Thank you. Jonathan Cully, are you doing the same thing? I know you said you ask with your tenants who are asking for help, whether they've applied for unemployment insurance or stimulus money.
Yeah,
Do
absolutely.
you actually have your managers help with that?
Hardship form. And one of the questions on the hardship form is what help have you sought from the government? Have you gotten your stimulus check? Have you applied for unemployment insurance? If you're self-employed, have you applied for a PPP loan? So we're asking all of those questions. And as Drew mentioned, every request we're dealing on a case-by-case basis. There's no one size fits all. I did have somebody ask for rent forgiveness, for an apartment, and we went back to their application and found out they had a net worth in the millions. And so, we declined the request. It was nonsensible. Made no sense. We have other people who are down to their last dollar and have no means of creating an income. The massage therapist who I mentioned, and that's one person that we did forgive some loan and have put a payment plan together. And we don't want to kick anybody out of their apartment. The eviction courts are closed, but even still, we don't want anybody to feel like their home is at risk because of this pandemic, which was no fault of their own. So we've tried to have a compassionate policy. Again, easy for me to say because the vast majority of our tenants have continued to pay.
Thank you. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues that people might want to consider. I know that our firm and many law firms in Maine put in all of our commercial and residential leases standard language that the landlord bears no responsibility for air quality issues. So I think it's important for that landlords check their leases to see if this is in there. In many cases, I've noticed lawyers specifically adding the word viruses to the exclusion, similar to what Jeff Lynn said that the insurance companies are doing. Obviously, if the lease is already signed, it is what it is. However, a lot of tenants are coming to landlords now, and they are asking for forgiveness or forbearance, as everybody has said. And one of the things that I know of many law firms are recommending is that if you agree to forgiveness, if you agree to forbearance, instead of treating that informally, that should be treated as a lease amendment to document it, to provide evidence, to explain what the deal is. And if your lease does not have in it an exclusion for air quality, this is a wonderful time to amend the lease to put that exclusion in there. As Drew Swenson brilliantly said, if you're going to negotiate the lease, it's a lease negotiation. If they can't pay rent and you want to extend it and extend the lease, this is the time to do that. I've taken a look, and I think many of us and all the lawyers in our community have taken a look at the CDC guidelines for landlords. And the truth is, there really are no hard and fast requirements. The CDC guidelines are, in fact, recommendations. I don't blame the CDC for that because, as everyone has correctly mentioned, you really can't have requirements for landlords. All buildings are different. Some buildings are big, some are small, some have no elevators, some have one, some have 10. So what the CDC has done is given us guidelines to think about and not requirements. There's a lot of good ideas there, so I agree everyone should be reading those guidelines. And my anecdotal experience has been that in Maine, the vast majority of landlords are accepting these guidelines, considering them, and doing as many of them as they feel are practical. And they're doing it for two reasons. One, they're doing it because it's the right thing to do. If a staircase is broken, we fix it. That's what we do. But the other reason that landlords are trying to follow CDC guidelines as much as possible is because there is a sense, and I think it's a correct sense, that when liability cases come, and they always do come, the sense is that landlords who follow these guidelines to the extent possible are probably going to not be liable for any COVID issues that come into in the building. One thing to consider, most leases obviously can't be amended, or no leases can be amended unilaterally. But Jamie Schwartz, who was not able to be here today, one of the things he wanted to talk about was that most commercial leases and most residential leases have a provision in them that say that while you can't unilaterally amend the lease, you can unilaterally amend the building rules. And this is something that a lot of landlords should look at and have been looking at. And so many landlords have informed people that there are some new rules, and these rules typically say masks must be worn in public areas, that where there are security desks, and Jonathan's right and Drew's right, there's not a lot of security desks in Maine, but we do have many buildings with them. Typically, plexiglass is put between the security desk and the person behind it. Typically, building rules have been amended to talk about social distancing for people who are not in the same family. I've seen a lot of rules that either say no elevator use or limited elevator use. The only no elevator use I've seen has mostly been out of state. I've seen a lot of limits on elevator use to one family at a time. I've seen rules that say where there's multiple elevators that one is going up and one is going down at any one given time to just limit the elevator use. But I just want to caution landlords that when we build these rules, when we build these protocols, it is incredibly important that you enforce them. I think one of the problems that I've seen in the past is when landlords develop a protocol, develop a rule, and don't enforce it, they find themselves liable for it. So if you're going to have a protocol, enforce it. If you're going to say everyone has to have their temperature taken before they enter into a building, then you've got to do it. And because of the reasons that Jonathan has correctly pointed out here, I don't recommend that. I recommend instead that landlords ask people to not socialize and go out if they're sick. I would ask commercial tenants not to come into the building if they're sick. But landlords are not policemen, and landlords are not doctors, and well, with minor exception, landlords are not epidemiologists. And this disease is everywhere, and it's not going away anytime soon. I mean, I hope it does, but it doesn't look like it does. So, as we as landlords are considering these rules, we need to be very careful to make sure that they're not going to be used against us. I do think that for many people, as Jonathan has suggested, we need to talk about closing down public spaces and certainly finding ways to clean them on a regular basis. I know a lot of landlords have. I don't know, Drew. In your case, have you ever done walkways where you put arrows and say people going this direction have to walk over here, and people going that direction have walked over there? Is that something you've considered? I see that in several buildings in the Portland area.
Yeah, I've seen it as well. The size of the buildings that we have really don't accommodate that kind of a traffic flow. So we have not done that, just given the space constraints that we're working with.
And I think legally, and Drew's put his finger on something very important. The real obligation of landlords in this COVID epidemic, I think, are to disclose. I mean, we're not responsible for the epidemic. We're not going to stop the pandemic. It's going to hit many of us. Many of us have already been hit so far. Unfortunately, that seems to be what's happening. What's important is not avoiding the disease, but so-called flattening the curve. And I think that that's what we have to do. Jonathan talked about lots of signage, and I think that really is the key. We need to disclose to our tenants that the pandemic is there and that there is a risk. We need to disclose the risk. Presumably people know it. But every time you walk into a commercial building, there's going to be a risk, and that should be disclosed. Every time you walk into a residential building, I mean, you have no choice because you live there, but it should be disclosed. And as Jonathan correctly said, and Jeff correctly said, we're all in this together. And as we go around Portland, we see that sign everywhere. Certainly every time I go to the supermarket, it's blaring every 5 seconds. We're all in it together. And I think that message really is one of disclosure. And that's the key, that landlords need to disclose to their tenants that there are risks out there, and that within reason, this is what we're doing to eliminate the risks. But it's a partnership, and we're not police, and we can't enforce all of these things. We can put out hand sanitizers, and we can say, please use them. We can put out, some people are putting out toothpicks for elevators, and we can use them. But all we can really do is tell people there are risks, and we need to all be careful, and we need to wear masks where appropriate and social distance where appropriate. Not everyone is going to do it, but we need to encourage it and let people know that this is not really something on the landlords. I don't know, Jeff Linder, are you seeing, there must be people who are calling you and asking you for your own ideas, right? I mean, people are
Yes,
struggling everywhere to find out who to talk to on this.
Exactly, and we held a return to work webinar a couple of weeks ago in conjunction with Maine Employers Mutual, where with our safety and director and our HR person, that was very well received. And MEMEC has provided a lot of return to work type of resources for the business community. I do think one of the questions that comes up, and is one I wanted to make sure we talked about, is and Jonathan touched on it, is privacy risk. And the CDC guidance specific for apartment operators, does mention that you should disclose to your tenants if there is a COVID case in the building, so they're aware and can take proper precautions. And that's a bit of a landmine. Most landlords probably aren't generally exposed to HIPAA law in general. And that's something to be very careful and mindful of. And I definitely would, if you run into that sort of situation, where if there is a COVID case in your building and you need to disclose, really work closely with your legal counsel to make sure you don't get into some other unintended type of hot water versus, just the virus transmission. And
that is
but,
a
that's
wonderful
the
point,
questions we
Jeff.
get.
And what I've been saying to landlords is, we can't police this. We can't take the positive COVID person and escort them out. What my firm has been recommending to landlords is when somebody reports that somebody in the building has active COVID, ask for permission to share this information with the other tenants and say to the other tenants that this is what one tenant has reported. And if you have questions, please call that tenant. Talking about questions, there's a question for Drew Swenson. The question is that Drew had mentioned upgrades to HVAC systems for commercial spaces. Can you expand on who pays for that, tenant or landlord? In terms of repairs and maintenance, it's usually on the tenant, but if you're going to replace, this is from an important real estate broker. So what do you think,
Sure.
Drew, who pays for a replacement? This is not just a repair.
Yep. Great question, because it comes up time and again. And depending upon the lease agreement is really, you have to read the lease agreement. What does the lease agreement provide for obligation? How does it share the financial obligation of making those changes to the HVAC system? Is it a repair and therefore in the demised premises and therefore a tenant cost? Or is it a capital expenditure and therefore a landlord cost? And there's obviously some disagreement between landlords and tenants about really how you define these retrofits or upgrades to provide some sort of HEPA filter system or ionization or UV light system. And they can be very expensive depending upon what you're doing, what the size of the system, how many units are in the demised premises. And given the fact that there are reductions in cash flow for landlords, they may not have the cash flow for these purposes. And if you look at let's assume a landlord wanted to get a loan they can't get a PPP loan because they don't have wages. So landlords really don't get PP loans, but they could get an EIDL loan, an economic injury disaster loan. But those are very clear in that they are not to be used for capital expenditures or expansions. And if the landlord could otherwise pay for things, then they have to use their own cash flow. They can't use an EIDL loan for these purposes. So I couldn't recommend that a landlord go get an EIDL loan and just use it. If they still have cash flow, use it to pay for these upgrades, because that's, I think, disallowed under the SBA program regulations. So it's a case-by-case analysis. Look at the lease agreements, what's in the language, and then invariably it's probably going to be negotiated, because if the tenant is having financial difficulties through the lockdown and now through the gradual reopenings, they may not have the funds to do this, but they may need to do it in order to continue to open and maybe open fully later on. And so there may be a lease amendment as well as a result of this, where there's some landlord shared participation in those costs, even though the lease agreement does not require it. And so there may be a lease extension, maybe a change in the escalator in the lease later on, a year or two out, where it can be affordable. So in essence, the tenant is paying for it, but on some greatly deferred basis, so that they can get through these current cash tight periods for themselves.
But as a former tax lawyer yourself, Drew, I take it that most leases, I take it, say that the CAM charges will cover repairs and maintenance, but not capital expenses. I take it there's going to be a constant fight as to whether when you replace your filter system with HEPA filters, which might be a major change to an HVAC system, depending what you've got. I mean, there's going to be a lot of tenants that are going to be screaming at you. That's a capital change, and that's not going into the CAM charges, right?
As a general rule, that's their first position coming out of the starting gate, yes. And then you have to discuss what it is. But yes, and this is a question of allocating economic burden. And most tenants feel that the landlord's probably full of cash and has no problem doing this. And it's not necessarily true. Quite a few landlords do not have, on certain buildings, do not have that cash flow. Maybe they were overfinanced. Maybe they have higher vacancy problems. Maybe they have many tenants who were retail tenants. For example, let's say a strip center is going to have a very difficult time with all those retail tenants. Whereas a mixed-use building downtown Portland that has a combination of essential workers who never left and were able to generate revenues, ground floor retail, they might be doing very well in their cash flow, and they could be more flexible in some of these. So it really goes back to the case-by-case analysis. working with tenants to the best of your ability to see what you can do to maintain a positive and good client relation or tenant relationship, and maintain cash flow for the buildings so that the banks are satisfied that you're meeting all your loan covenants.
It sounds like a good future lease amendment that when you have to upgrade, make capital improvements due to pandemics, perhaps that should be included in the CAM charges. We also have a question from a very famous Portland lawyer who is asking all of us, what happens when a tenant comes to you, reports to you that one of his or her employees has been determined to be positive for COVID, and says that, by the way, this employee has been to all the public bathrooms, has been in and out of the offices, has used the elevators, has walked the halls. What do you recommend that we as landlords or as insurance brokers, what do people think about our obligations, moral or actual? Jonathan, I'll give you a chance to say that. I mean, I'm assuming that without giving.
It's a good question because my buildings are largely residential. You know, our tenants have no obligation to report to us if they're have a positive test. You know, we didn't experience that. I think certainly what we do is we ask them to stay in their apartment, and we increase the cleaning. And I think, as Jeff said, I think there is guidance that we would have to notify our building. I would assume it would be in a manner that protected the privacy of the infected patient. But again, I think it's clean and communicate, and that's really all we can do.
Jonathan, there are these services. I don't know how reputable they are or not. They might be very reputable, that come in with looks like radiation suits and sprays. And have you ever considered using these people, or would you ever consider
no,
using
I haven't.
them?
I know they were doing that in Wuhan, China, a lot at the beginning.
Yes.
You know, the science is you know, Drew used the word fluid. Even the science is fluid, and we're learning more as we go. Initially, the hard surfaces were sort of viewed as one of the big culprits. Now the science is indicating that hard surfaces are less of a source of transmission, and it's more the aerosols. So you know, I wouldn't rush to start spraying a lot of chemicals inside my building unless the science was telling me to do that. It's like everything; we've got to follow the science. The science is fluid. You know, part of what we do with respect to even this disinfecting, I mean, we're disinfecting elevator buttons all day. Now the science is telling us that hard surfaces are less of a culprit in transmission. You know, some of what we do is based on science. Some of what we do is really about our tenants' peace of mind and trying to reassure them that we are taking all the appropriate steps to make sure that their residence is a safe place. But I would tend not to overreact unless there was convincing science, David.
And Drew, have you ever experienced, have you had any tenants that have called and said, we have a COVID positive employee, and what do you think about these disinfectants? I mean, I believe that in Korea and China, one of the reasons they're doing this great disinfection everywhere is not because of science, but to alleviate fear and to inspire confidence.
I think there's in anything we do, there are a couple of reasons we do it. So dual purpose, I would say. One is, as you and Jonathan have confirmed, and which I agree with, is that confidence building, comfort building is very important if we want people to return to more of a normal, people to go to restaurants again, whether it's indoors or out, and so on. But the other is, even though the science does change, Jonathan's spot on, we know that disinfecting can do some good, some benefit. So although we have not had any incidents, we do have written incident response plans here in Maine in the buildings, which are recommended. In Massachusetts and New York, where we have other offices, those are requirements. We actually have to have incident response plans. We have to have action steps, and the states are providing those that you can fill out, a kind of a template concept to make sure that you actually do have a janitorial crew, whether it's the spacesuit folks or your existing janitorial vendor, who has confirmed in writing, here is our written disinfectant plan. This is consistent with CDC requirements and recommendations. And so what we've done in our buildings is to ensure that the vendors are consistent. They have shared with us their incident response plans, their disinfectant plans. So we are ready to report to the CDC if there's an event, to bring in the vendor to do that disinfectant work, to communicate, trying to maintain to the fullest extent possible the privacy of the affected individual. But we feel it's important that for tracing purposes, this tracking concept, that we inform the CDC, that we inform other people on a floor or as tenants, all the tenants, so that they can take appropriate actions, because we do anticipate, certainly in other states, New York City being a prime example where it was such a hot spot, that these are all requirements. This is not just recommendations. We are required to maintain these digitally in the office. We are required to have senior management review these reports on a daily basis. Who came in? When did they come in? When did they leave? Did they answer all the CDC symptom questions negatively? Did they get their temperature taken? Was it under 100.3? And that has to be digitized at the end of the day under the signature of a senior management person in the firm. So this is true of all the landlords. This is true of all the companies, the tenants, and the property managers have these obligations. Again, that's a hot spot in New York. Our density and risks here are less in Maine, but that's not to say that the state at some point won't see that's best practice. We have to do it here too. So I think we've tried to get a little bit of ahead of the curve and put these written plans in place and know what we're going to do when these events occur. But knock on wood, it hasn't happened yet, but it will eventually. It's only a matter of time.
Jeffrey Lind, are the carriers beginning to weigh in on this issue? People must be calling their insurance companies and saying, I need help. I mean, how often do I disinfect? What do I disinfect? Do I use the spacesuits or do I go with the science? I mean, are you beginning to get these calls, or some of the carriers beginning to give thoughts?
We are, and we've been getting questions since mid-March, when the outbreak really came to the forefront. The general guidance that that the carriers have been providing is that if there is a known outbreak, that you do the appropriate disinfecting. They're not necessarily again not prescribing the method. They're deferring to CDC guidelines on what that disinfecting should look like. And then becomes the issue afterwards is, well, who's going to pay for it? Is it does the tenant pay for it? Does it because you look at the indemnity clause in the lease and describe who's responsible for paying for this cost. But I think the first response is do what needs to be done in order to prevent further loss. And then I guess the next step is then trying to figure out, okay, who's going to bear the cost of it, or is it going to be a shared cost, or how does that work within the confines of the lease agreement?
And under most leases, I assume that this constant disinfection is going to be a maintenance issue, which is going to be a CAM charge. And I think a lot of tenants are going to be very surprised when they look at their CAM charges and see how high they've gone up. A lot of tenants have negotiated caps on increases in common area maintenance charges. So, but as Drew and Jonathan both said, we're going to be taking a look at these leases. And as we draft leases in the next 100 years, I think we're going to have a lot of new considerations to negotiate, and a lot of new things to put in it. But I really appreciate tremendously all of your thoughts, your brilliances, your ideas. I want to thank all the people. We have over 100 people that have registered for today's program and have been asking questions. I want everybody to know that this program has been recorded. For those people that want to see it 2 or 3 times more, they can contact Merida and go on the Merida website, and this program will be available to people that want to see it again, and it will be available to people that haven't had a chance to see it because they're tied up at this point in time. But thank you to Norway Savings Bank, again, our sponsor. Thank you very much to Drew Swenson, Jonathan Cully, and Jeffrey Lind for taking the time to share your ideas and your thoughts with us today. If anybody does have questions in the audience and did not get a chance to ask the questions, please feel free to send it in, and all of our panelists will be happy to look at them and to give you a exciting answer. We're in a new normal, so none of the answers are guaranteed, but we're all out here in it together, doing the best we can. And thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.